Last week, we started to look at the Sermon on the Mount by considering the wisdom of the Beatitudes. We saw how the blessings that Jesus pronounced were and are contrary to so much worldly wisdom. In a world that is so often cynical, skeptical, and bound up in notions of cold-hearted pragmatism, we are called to a life of something different, a life of hope, wonder, and compassion. Because we are called to this life of difference, we are also called to play a specific sort of role in this world, and that is what Jesus gives us some insight into with today's passage. So let's start with the first metaphor that Jesus uses. You are the salt of the earth. Now, Jesus really doesn't give us any clues as to what this means, other than to say that when salt loses its saltiness, it's no good anymore and has to be gotten rid of. So the first question here is, why make this comparison to salt? Today we tend to think of salt primarily in the context of table salt, or maybe at this time of year the unrefined rock salt that helps dissolve ice. But in the ancient Near East, salt was used in a ton of different ways. I found an article from the American Society of Overseas Research that was about the industrial process of salt making in ancient Israel. In addition to some really neat diagrams of how the ancient salt pans operated and some photographs of the remnants of those ancient processes, they had a pretty comprehensive list of uses for salt, which included preservation of foods such as meat, fish, fruits, and vegetables such as olives, the production of cheese, use in the leather industry, glazing ceramics, separating metals from one another, the dyeing of textiles, use in medicines, and use in cosmetics. And all of that in addition to its use as a flavor enhancer in food consumption. So first of all, I don't think we have to look at this metaphor and assume that Jesus had one specific thing in mind. And if we're going to make any sort of general assumption about what Jesus means here, then it's what we heard from Wendy earlier today, that his followers are meant to be vital to the daily life of the world. But when we try to narrow it down to one specific thing that we're meant to do, that's where I think things get more difficult to posit a singular, correct interpretation. One could very well say that we are meant to bring life to the world around us. After all, in a world prior to refrigeration, the ability to preserve foods with salt would have been an essential part of agricultural economics. And if we're going down this path of reading the metaphor as speaking of the preservative nature of salt, then we could make it a little more abstract, and we could suggest that being the salt of the earth means that we are called to preserve those things like hope, wonder, and compassion in a world that tends toward despair, that in the midst of grief, sorrow, pain, and trauma, we are meant to hold on to the goodness of things, to be a life preserver for those on the edge of hopelessness. But maybe instead we consider the industrial uses of salt in the ancient world. Maybe we consider that salt was used in leather making and textile productions. And we would recall the words of Jesus later in his ministry, that those who follow him should clothe the naked. In this metaphor, we see that in a world ensnared by powers that seek the degradation of the human being in body, mind, and spirit, we are called to be agents of dignity. One of the themes that Pope Francis has returned to time and again over the years is the irrepressible dignity of every human being. He has stressed that if we are to have compassion to those in need, we must allow them to be dignified agents of their own destiny. So maybe, by being the salt of the earth, we can empower others to live into the dignity that God intends for them. Or maybe, when we consider the use of salt in cosmetics, dyes, and pottery, we're called to be agents of beauty in the world. Maybe what Jesus is saying here is that salt is necessary to the creation of so much art, and that we ought to be like that. I know that art, being a subjective medium, is open to many interpretations of meaning, but I find notions that art is merely something that's meant to provoke a reaction to be too reductive of art's purpose. Art has the power to reveal great truths about reality, and artists often have the gift of seeing through the illusions of society in a way that others cannot. If we follow this meaning, then is it any wonder that throughout the ages the church has produced incredible works of art, from the majesty of towering cathedrals to the ability of the liturgy to draw us out of the present and into the heavenly courts, or to the ability of poems and songs to tug at our heartstrings and inspire us to heights of ecstasy. And when we start to pull out all of these possible meanings, maybe we're finally starting to get a glimpse of what Jesus meant. Maybe it's in bringing together all of these kinds of images that the picture of the Christian life starts to emerge. A vital life that uplifts every aspect of being, a life that speaks to the whole of the person. Well-being not just in body, not just in mind, not just in spirit, but well-being in every way. And yet, Jesus warns that when salt goes bad, it loses its meaning. When it stops doing what salt does, then the only purpose for it is to be trampled underfoot. So how does salt go bad? Well, if we mean actual salt, then it goes bad because over time, chemical impurities in the salt come to the forefront and ruin it. One of the ways for this to occur is for salt to be exposed to humidity, which causes the salt to break down, leaving nothing behind but an impure byproduct. You can easily imagine how in the ancient world, with nothing more than wood and ceramics to store things in, it would have been hard to keep salt in a coastal environment like Judea for long periods of time. But if we're talking about followers of Christ, then the metaphor doesn't have to change too much. If we allow ourselves to be exposed for too long to forces that break down our dignity, that break down our hope, that break down our wonder, then we too can lose the thing that makes us different from the world. We start to taste just like the cynicism and the despair of the world around us. Our words become bitter and harsh and unsavory. Our actions stem from rottenness and lead to death. So Jesus offers us a choice. Serve life, serve dignity, serve beauty, serve the Lord, or become like the world and fall away into unrighteousness. And it's on this note that I want to turn briefly to the second metaphor that he uses this morning. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hid. People do not light a lamp and put it under a bushel basket. These images are deeply ingrained in American Christianity. From the earliest ages of Sunday school, we learn to sing that we're not going to hide our light under a bushel basket. In the second half of the 20th century, the image of America as a shining city on a hill became a rallying cry invoked by leaders of both major political parties. But that image in particular, that image of the city on a hill, goes back much further. It goes back before the founding fathers of the American Revolution had even been born. It goes back to a preacher named John Winthrop, who preached his dreams of a city on a hill to his fellow puritanical pilgrims in 1630 as they prepared to embark for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. You can easily find this sermon online, and I encourage you to go read the whole thing if you never have. It's not very long, and I think it's pretty interesting. But in this sermon, Winthrop recognizes that there is a responsibility for putting yourself in a place where the whole world can see you. After speaking about the articles that the pilgrims have drawn up amongst themselves, he warns that if they fail to live up to the standard of conduct that will be required of them, that the Lord will surely break out in wrath against us and be revenged of such a people and make us know the price of the breach of such a covenant. It's here that he arrives at the high point of his sermon, and it's here that I wish to share at some length his words. He proclaimed, "Now the only way to avoid this shipwreck and to provide for our posterity is to follow the counsel of Micah, to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. For this end, we must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. We must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work, as members of the same body. So shall we keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. The Lord will be our God and delight to dwell among us as his own people, and will command a blessing upon us in all our ways, so that we will see much more of his wisdom, power, goodness, and truth than formerly we have been acquainted with. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God and all professors for God's sake. We shall shame the face of many of God's worthy servants and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us, till we be consumed out of the good land whither we are going." I want to make sure that you caught the point that he's making here, so let me summarize really quickly what he said. First, those who seek to be a shining light of God's work in the world have to love their neighbor without reservation, sharing in their sufferings and foregoing one's own wants to satisfy another's needs. Second, once you put yourself out there for everyone to see, then everyone will be watching. And if you slip up, you not only provide ammunition to the enemies of God, but you bring disgrace to everyone else who calls themselves a servant of God. It is undoubtedly a blessing to be the light of the world. But we know that we are not blessed merely for our own sakes. We are blessed to be a blessing. That is the responsibility of the covenant from the first moment that God enters into relationship with God's people. So if we're going to call ourselves Christians, if we're going to enter into a relationship with God and present ourselves to the world as God's ambassadors, then we can't enter into that lightly. We have been given a great power to make the world a better place. So let's be responsible with that power. Let us always remember that we are called to be instruments of hope, of beauty, of joy, and of peace. Amen. Please pray with me. Light from light, true God from true God, shape us into vessels of your mercy. Allow us to cast your light into all of the places of the world where there is darkness and despair. Empower us to preserve life and dignity, to make tomorrow more beautiful than today. Do not hide us from the world, but put us where everyone can see, so that your light will shine forth. Amen.